Morning. Welcome. Thank you so much for joining us today here at the Wilson Center in Washington, and the many of you joining us online to follow today's conversation. My name is Benjamin Gadan. I direct the Latin America program here at the Wilson Center. Uruguay gets high praise for its low levels of poverty and inequality, for the strength of its democracy, and the consistency and dependability of its rule of law. The downside is that its elections sometimes seem slightly less consequential than in parts of the region where polarization regularly produces dramatic swings in public policy. In Uruguay, moreover, there is no question that the October 27th election will go smoothly, as would any transition of power. Investors, for that reason, are not biting their nails. The National Party candidate, former presidential advisor Álvaro Delgado, and the former Frente Amplio mayor of Canelones, Yamandú Orsi, are both well-known figures. No matter the result, we're unlikely to see jolting changes to Uruguay's economic strategies or the rules of the game for businesses, local and international. Of the most iconic moments of President Luis Lacalle Pou's presidency, one was the victory rally in 2019 when he acknowledged an opposition voter who was holding a sign that read, "Felicitaciones, si les va bien, a mí también, suerte." In another viral image from 2022, the president is seen calmly eating alone at a lunch counter in Carrasco. The absence of drama in Uruguay is a feature, not a bug, of its political culture and economic system. Even so, and maybe this is because I've lived in Montevideo and I remain a great fan, I think this election is pretty exciting and worthy of our time this morning. Polls show a race that's too close to call, and voters are not only casting their ballots for the president, who will serve a 5-year term, but also weighing in on not one but two major referenda on hot-button issues, security and social security. Uruguay's last presidential election in 2019 was a turning point. Lacalle Pou's victory marked the end of 15 consecutive years in power for the Frente Amplio, the country's major center-left coalition. Soon, in just a few weeks, we will learn whether Uruguay, population 3.4 million, wants to see a deepening of Lacalle Pou's pro-business model or a return to the progressive social policies of the Frente Amplio. Surveys have shown crime and unemployment consistently as the top voter concerns. To dig deeper into the factors that will shape Uruguay's election, I'm joined this morning in Washington and online by several terrific experts, including my friend and former colleague, Nicolás Salias of the Economist Intelligence Unit, the EIU, Amparo Mercader, a board member at Global Americans, joining online from Montevideo, Gabriel Odone, president of Agora Uruguay, and my friend Pedro Isern, executive director of our co-sponsors for today, Sescos, who will be joining us from Montevideo and offering now some brief remarks to welcome us today. Pedro.
Thank you so much, Ben. It is an honor for Sescos to co-host this conference with the prestigious Wilson Center. As we all know, the Uruguayan democracy has been a remarkable institutional experience, but it is still facing relevant productivity challenges. At the Wilson Center, maybe you remember, we discussed a similar topic 5 years ago, namely that Uruguay is a welfare state and Uruguay will continue to be a welfare state. The question is then, what kind of welfare state? No? The Uruguayan issue should be how to build a more efficient, a much more efficient welfare state. I think this is the Uruguayan issue. At Sescos, we think that this is the Uruguayan issue. Well, thank you very much, Nico, my friend, Amparo, Gabriel, and Presidente Lacalle Herrera for your time and willingness to talk about this. And thank you, Ben, back to you, so we can discuss the topic. Thank you so much.
Gracias, Pedro. Thank you so much. And you spoiled the surprise with your remarks there, but we do have the enormous privilege of announcing that not only do we have such fantastic experts joining us again online and here, but also we have former Uruguayan President Luis Lacalle Herrera, who will be providing some introductory remarks from Montevideo. He is well known by all of you watching and listening today. A member of the ruling party, served as president from 1990 to 1995, a historic period for Uruguay and the Southern Cone that saw the establishment of the Mercosur trade bloc. He's a lawyer and former journalist and was a prominent opponent of the authoritarian regime that ruled Uruguay from 1973 until the mid-1980s. He has a special relationship, of course, with Uruguay's current president, his son, but he has promised that today he will give us independent analysis of the factors shaping this election, the challenges and opportunities that the next president of Uruguay will face. So, Mr. President, bienvenido, muchísimas gracias. Thank you so much for joining us here.
Thank you very much. Good morning to everyone. In the first place, I would like to remember that in 1986, I had the privilege of joining a meeting in the Wilson Center in Washington with a very peculiar detail that three of the participants, were bound to be elected presidents. Ricardo Lagos from Chile and Jorge Valle and myself from Uruguay. We didn't know it at that time. Perhaps we were thinking about it, but not knowing that we would be elected presidents. Well, I have the pleasure of participating with Gabriel Odone, who is a prominent economist from the Frente Amplio and a very knowledgeable economist at that. In this country, we have this wonderful tradition of having good relationships, good personal relationships over the differences in politics. Many of you may be familiar, but I think any conference on the Uruguayan democracy must remember some historic details. We have the oldest party system in the world. The two main traditional or foundational parties, Partido Blanco and Partido Colorado, red and white, not red because of communism, but the color of the scarves they used in the war. We are the oldest parties in the world. 1836 was the beginning of those parties. And for almost all the history of Uruguay, they dominated the political system. Why? Up to 1970, they collected or they obtained more than 80% of the vote. The rest was divided upon small parties like the Socialist Party, Communist Party, and the Catholic Democrats, Christian Democrats. Why? Because this party system, these two parties, are a vertical cut of society. They are not promoting social differences, not rich against poor, the city against the country, the academics against the analphabets. No, there are vertical cuts of society, much like the steel rods inside a concrete column. You cannot see them, but they provide two great virtues for a political system: stability and flexibility. So these two main parties were a vertical gap in the sense that rich people in both, poor people in both, lawyers in both, peasants in both, all the segments of society were represented in both parties. That ended in 1971, when the broad Frente or Frente Amplio was born and participated in the elections. What is the Frente Amplio? It's a coalition of leftist parties: the Communist Party, the Socialist Party, the former Christian Democrats, and some fractions of the traditional parties that preferred to emigrate to this coalition. Now it has become the single biggest party. 40%, around 40% of the people vote for el Frente Amplio in Uruguay. There was an important change in the history, in the electoral history of our country. In 1996, we adopted the system of 2 rounds for the presidential election. First round, if neither gets 50% plus 1, then you had a second round of the first and second in the first round. The ballotage system. That changed a lot the organization of parties, because knowing that with 40%, Frente Amplio, around 40%, will become one of the finalists in the last election, the other parties tended to form another coalition, because it was the only way to stop or obtain victory over the Frente Amplio. And that has changed very much, because formerly you were blanco or colorado, white or red, with both traditional parties, and we had centuries of discussion, of conflicts, even civil wars long ago. Now we had, by obligation of the constitutional system, to join one another to challenge the Frente Amplio in the second round. And that has changed the way of thinking at the election. We are then running all parties in October, and the first and second, if neither obtains the absolute majority, in November 1st and 2nd. That's why the general scope of the election is more thinking about the second round than the first. In the first, you elect the parliament with the presidential candidates. In the second, only the presidential contest. That is very interesting, and that has changed the way of thinking at the election. We have the local elections in separate dates. The municipal elections, the local elections, are held in July 2025. Thus, we have only the national election of president and members of parliament. One interesting thing, not electoral, but yes, political, of the Uruguayan system, which I very much like to signal, is the vote is mandatory. Well, not the vote. Going to the polls is mandatory. I think that is very important, because there is a general feeling of indifference towards the democratic system all over the world. You know it in the States, when it's completely voluntary, and countries in which 45%, 40% of people are deciding over the 100% of the population. The mandate is to go to the polling station. You cannot mandate the vote, but remember what the draft was. Well, the old system in the States of the draft called every citizen to the defense of the country, and was a great factor of equality, because the gentlemen and ladies after called for the draft were from all classes, rich, poor, New York, Oklahoma. And that was a great unifier of the country in the defense. I think that the mandatory presence in the polling station is very good. Then you can vote or not vote because that is an individual decision. That is very important in our country. But before the mandatory vote was established in 1967, 80% went to the polls. So it was a country of deep democratic sensation, activity, and faith. Now that is changing, perhaps we need the mandatory concurrence to the voting point. The other thing which I cherished in my country is no re-election, no immediate re-election. You must wait till 5 years if you want to come back at the end of your term as president. Then you go home, think about it. If you think too much, you don't run again. But sometimes we forget enough to be able to try it again. I did it and I didn't succeed. But it's a very good thing that the president knows that he has only one 5-year term, 60 months to do what he can, and not having the hope of a second immediate term. And the other characteristic of my country, which I like very much to underline, is that the Supreme Court is elected by Parliament with no intervention of the executive. The executive will learn by the papers of the TV who had been elected to Supreme Court. We have a Supreme Court of 5 members that have limited terms, 10 years or 70 years of age. Whichever arrives first, you go home. But it's elected by the Parliament, of course, with a special majority. I think that nowadays, with this tendency of lawfare and judaizing all politics, like in Argentina, for instance, you have a war of presentation of parties one against the other in the judicial system. It's very important to underline this. Well, what we are electing then in 35 days time is the first round. The polls are signaling, just like in the States, uneven division of the electorate. Last time when President Lacalle's son was elected, it was by a margin of 30,000 votes or 25,000, just a very slim majority, but majority in the end. So I think this time we will have a repetition and another chapter of the same numbers in the election. We have certain dangers. One danger is universal, is the influence of the networks, and the use of these new systems of communication. Some very optimistically said, oh, now you have democracy in your phone, in your cell phone, we could enjoy a system like the Athenians did, direct democracy. You can vote every morning on any subject. Well, it didn't work like that. Now we have in the networks this obsession of people connecting with each other and not hearing the other, affirming what they think, joining groups, and of course the cowardice of anonymity, which tends to promote the worst of human beings in the network. that is a great danger. And of course, the main problem of democracy nowadays is the representation. Are we really represented by the people we elect? Does he or she represent me and my members of the same party? The essence of representation is challenged. And I think that it's the worst menace of the electoral system and the democratic system we have. Let's hope then that Uruguayans will vote knowledgeable, trying to find out what the politicians are offering. I always dread big programs this thick. I love programs of 2 pages because there's less space to lie in the programs. So let's hope that over the difference we have with Gabriel and the members of the Frente Amplio, we will have a democratic, solid government after November. Thank you.
Excellent. Gracias, señor presidente. Thank you so much. That was terrific context for the conversation and historical understanding of the party system. I hope 1986 was not the last time that you visited us, but either way, you should come again soon. Of course, your son is also welcome. This is a space that we hope can be used to discuss important issues going on in Uruguay, not only in this electoral period, but throughout. So thank you very much. It was a pleasure to have you participate. I want to turn now to you, Nicolas, to talk about one of the big issues that we had mentioned earlier for this election. The polling has consistently showed that crime and public safety in general are the biggest concern voters bring to this election. And in fact, there's a referendum about policing that would give police the authority to conduct nighttime raids on private homes. It's supported by the government, opposed by the Frente Amplio. My question is, what will happen with that referendum? What does it represent? But also, more broadly speaking, crime as an electoral issue, how does that shape the electoral debate and the potential outcome?
Well, thanks, Ben. Thank you for inviting me to this event. So yes, crime is a major issue in Uruguay. And as you mentioned, opinion polls show that Uruguayans are most concerned about crime. It is a serious problem in the country. The country historically sees itself as a very peaceful country. Its own narrative is that it's a peaceful country, it's a country with low levels of crime, but statistically speaking, it's not necessarily true. According to Insight Crime, Uruguay's homicide rate in 2023 was 11.2 per 100,000, which is actually double the US rate. It's also significantly higher than the Chilean rate, which is at 4.5. So Uruguay has this kind of unspoken problem with violence. Domestic violence is another major problem in the country, not just criminal violence. The other problem Uruguay has that many people tend to avoid talking about is the high level of incarceration. According to prison statistics, Uruguay has, and this is hard to believe, but it's true, the world's 10th highest rate of incarceration on a per capita basis. Actually 4th in Latin America. So behind El Salvador, Cuba, and Panama is Uruguay. And I think in the collective consciousness of the Uruguayan people, they don't really see that, and certainly people outside of Uruguay don't see that. So we do have a problem with crime, we do have a problem with security, and we have a problem also with how to deal with it. I think Uruguay has antiquated ideas about crime, antiquated ways of dealing with crime. And prisons are a major issue. Now, I'll get to that in a second, but talking about the referendum you're talking about, the nighttime raids, polls show a supermajority support that, over 60%. And what that suggests is that it's a cross-partisan thing. It doesn't matter, it's not a left-right issue. Many people from the Frente Amplio, which is the left-of-center party in Uruguay, for some context, support the referendum. Because there is a feeling that this is a growing problem. And Uruguay is actually kind of a strange country in that nighttime raids aren't allowed by the Constitution. It's one of the only countries in the world that actually has that provision. So this would get rid of that. and would allow the police forces or security forces to have more capacity to deal with what is obviously a significant and more complicated problem than traditional crime in the past. And what I mean by that is that Uruguay, again, the collective consciousness is not where the reality is in Uruguay. And so what I would say the big problem in Uruguay is you do have the emergence of transnational criminal organizations in the country. You have Brazilian organizations like, I might butcher this, but I think it's called Primero Comando da Capital, which is from Sao Paulo. We know it's in Uruguay, and now there's also suspicions that Tren de Aragua is in Uruguay, which, if you know the Chilean case, is a particularly dangerous criminal organization. And again, Uruguayans need to be aware that this is a real problem, a real threat, and a threat not just for the obvious reasons, not just a security reason, but it's a threat to our democracy. If we don't deal with the problem of this, if we don't nip it in the bud, so to speak, you will see the emergence probabilistically of populists who will begin to attack the political establishment, so to speak, saying that it's not sufficiently capable of dealing with this problem. So the big advantage Uruguay has, and the president articulated this so well, the respect that everyone has for each other in the country fundamentally, in terms of regardless of the partisan differences. And I think that's one thing that all parties have to come together, and they all have to come to an agreement of how to deal with this problem, respecting democracy, but also acknowledging that this is a wicked problem that requires significant policy innovation for a country like Uruguay. And we're well placed to do that. So I would say the referendum will pass. There's no question about that. Politically speaking, one last thing I would say is that, getting into the politics of this a little bit, this issue of crime does favor the coalition for voters.
The governing coalition.
The governing coalition, correct. The parties of the governing coalition have been more forward, let's put it that way, regarding how to deal with crime, and forward in a way that deals with it in a direct way. That is, using the police, security forces, and not denying that there are underlying causes to be addressed, but that there has to be also a very explicit and forward way of dealing with it with using security forces. So I think that the Frente Amplio's opposition to this will ultimately harm or hinder its ability to appeal to voters who are worried about this. And finally, I know I'm taking more time, but as an EIU analyst for Uruguay, I have come out with a call saying that the coalition will win this election. Very narrowly, as the president articulated so well, Uruguay is a 50-50 country. But one of the reasons that substantiates that view is exactly what I was just saying, that voters are aware that there has to be a more clear and contundente way of dealing with crime. And the Frente Amplio, unfortunately, I think, has not yet come to the conclusion of how to do that in a way that appeals to its own base.
Thank you, Nicolas. Amparo, the former president pointed out that there's no immediate reelection in Uruguay, and so at the end of this 5-year term, his son, President Lacalle Pou, will be leaving office. But these elections, nevertheless, are to some degree referenda on the performance of the president and of the governing party. And so I was hoping you could give us a little bit of a sense of the public opinion of how things have gone under this president. There's obviously been some difficult moments, in particular the drought that had caused some major economic challenges for Uruguay. And this is a period where many heads of state throughout Latin America and elsewhere have struggled to maintain public support. But I think polling has been rather promising and fairly stable. So tell me the president's public standing right now and how this candidate closely associated with the president is affected by that.
Thank you, Ben, for inviting me. Really appreciate the opportunity. So there's a lot of questions packed in there. So let's see how we can unpack it. The first thing I have to say is the popularity of the president is incredibly high. If he were to run, there would be no question he would win. It's just he's one of the most highly rated in the continent. So I would say in that regard, I think it speaks volumes. One of the things that I often hear that is kind of maybe going to be very telling of his legacy is la libertad responsable. I think during COVID, the fact that he approached in a way that was so in tune with how Uruguayans feel about their ability to act independently, to not be forced into different programs, but rather to, again, be very social and very careful about everyone around them. This is very much, I think, in the DNA of the Uruguayans, and I think he hit absolutely the right spot. And when we saw, for example, across the river in Argentina, so all of the COVID lockdowns, I think many people in Uruguay were so happy to be Uruguayans. I think, this is defining moment in the soul of, I think, the country. In terms of where we are from an economic standpoint. So I think the government has done quite well from a macroeconomic perspective. So there's a lot of stability, inflation is under control, despite all the pressures from a financial fiscal perspective. This has been managed. There's been tremendous job creation. This is very important. I think the idea was not to depend on government programs as much, but to give people the opportunity to go out and work. And I think the government was able to meet that promise. So we see growth, we see inflation under control. The risk from a sovereign perspective, it's at a record low. It's issuing debt, long-term debt, at only 110 basis points above the U.S. Treasury. I mean, that's the U.S. government debt. That's how strong and well-rated it is. ESG ratings also impact the thirst there is for Uruguayan bonds. So I think these are all really great accomplishments. I want to go back, Ben, to something you said at the very beginning, which is that what happens in this election doesn't matter. And I'd like to challenge that a little bit, because I feel like sometimes here in the US, we're a little bit lukewarm about the differences of what the different governments might bring to the table. And I do think that there's a difference, and I do think that that we could, if we flip-flop, right, like if we go back to the Frente Amplio, there's a greater chance of undoing some of the accomplishments. And I'd like to mention two, one more from an economic standpoint and another more political. From an economic standpoint, one of the things that's on the ballot, along with this referendum on night rates, there's a referendum on the social security system, the pension system. So the government, and it took a lot of political goodwill, was able to achieve a reform. And Uruguay, like a lot of other countries, is facing demographic challenges, right? It's aging population, and it was able to get to a reform where, very mature, there was an agreement to raise the retirement age. This is something that is happening around the world. So the more radical fractions within the Frente Amplio, the opposition, want to undo this. This would be an absolute mess. There's a referendum and there's polling, and the polling sometimes comes very close to having it pass. If this referendum were to pass, Uruguay could lose investment grade. It could, creates an enormous question on the rule of law. Like, again, this is not what Uruguay stands for. Uruguay stands for stability. And so it's quite scary. And so, I think that for looking at it from the United States, we have to be a little bit sensitive to, there is a lot on the ballot. Yes, it's in a Uruguayan way. There's strong institutional belts and suspenders, so to speak, but there still is a risk. And again, the flip-flopping is going to pull us back, and we want to continue to move forward. And the other point I want to make is from a political and international perspective. So Uruguay has been, and it's known for its international standing. It's a strong voice. I mean, it's the Uruguay round of God, right? Like Uruguay punches way above its waist when it comes to international matters. And I have to say the position in relation to Venezuela is very telling. So the President Lacalle Pou, his minister Paganini, his ambassador here in Washington, Abdallah, have all been very vocal denouncing what's happening with Venezuela and supporting the elections and speaking out against Maduro. Unfortunately, what we're seeing from the candidate of the Frente Amplio is not giving us that same level of comfort. So when asked whether he would be invited to his inauguration if he were to be elected president, candidate Orsi said, well, it all depends on the size of the cake. I don't think it's something that we can be laughing about. This is not a joke. People are dying in Venezuela. And again, for looking at it from a Washington perspective, we want a strong democratic partner. And I think that this flip-flopping and, again, strength of some of the more radical perspectives within Uruguay, it's not something that will help us continue to grow, because that's, I think, critical, right? Like there's been a period of accomplishments, and I think continuity is important. So hopefully we can achieve some of that continuity and put some of those risks to the side.
Many thanks. The question, Gabriela, I want to ask you is to dig a bit deeper into economic conditions in Uruguay. We've heard about some significant headwinds that this government faced over the years, the pandemic, the drought, and yet reasonable job growth, inflation under control, and the polling of the president, I think, reflecting that. From your perspective and the perspective perhaps of the Frente Amplio opposition, how do you see the average Uruguayan voter viewing the economy right now, and how is that a factor in this election?
So good morning for everyone, and it's a pleasure for me to be here, especially with the former president, like Mr. Lacalle. So a very good man, and he continues introducing topics and discussion in the country, and it's very important to the country that people like him discuss with us. And also it's a pleasure for me to stay here with Nicolás and Amparo, because we have a long relation. So thank you very much for the Wilson Center to stay here today. So I had, as is obvious, a different perspective in many things, especially with the last things that Amparo told you. The first one I want to say is Uruguay needs a strong agenda related with accelerated growing, and also to reform the social cohesion model that the country has. So for many years, the country, in the last decade, Uruguay only grew around 1% by year, is in average. This year, we are going to grow around 3%, but it's just a recovery because the last year was a very bad year for the activity, for the economic activity, for many reasons. So it's not exactly that the country is doing well in the last 10 years, and not just during this administration, also the last administration from the Frente Amplio. We need to accelerate the growth because the country needs to sustain the social protection model that we want to have, grow around 2%, 2.5%. This is at least the potential growth that the country needs. At the same time, we need to accelerate the potential growth, but this is another discussion. So it's not exactly that the country is doing well in economic terms, especially because at the same time, we didn't grow an important average in the last decade. At the same time, we lost during the pandemic, we increased during the pandemic the poverty and also the inequality growth. It's true that after that, we improved these numbers, but now we are under the figures that we used to have in 2019. So the problem here is the country have important things to do for the future, and especially this government was elected to introduce more important reforms in the to increase and to improve the efficiency of the economy, and these reforms didn't pass during this government. So for the next period of time, it doesn't matter who is going to be in office, the left of the right. We have challenges in terms to introduce important reform in the no-trade sector. We need to introduce important reforms to increase the efficiency and the competition in important sectors like energy, transport, and also health. And at the same time, we need to, especially if the left won the election, we need to do a lot of things in terms of improve our social cohesion model. So this means that it's true that during this government, the inflation converged to the rate around 6%. At the end of this period of government, the inflation is going to be on 6%, but coming from the 8% that it used to have. But it's not true that the inflation is not under control before this government. So the inflation in the country is under control in the last 20 years. But it's true that the inflation, the level of inflation that used to have before this government is very high, and it's a good result from coming from this the policy of this government to reduce this average inflation to 6%. But to do that, the government follow a way that introduce some collateral effects in terms of appreciation of our currency, and this reduce the capacity of competition of the economy in the world, and this is going to be a problem again, a challenge for the new administration. So we need to consolidate this level of inflation, but at the same time we need to do something to improve the capacity of competition especially for the trade sector. That means we need to introduce important reforms and to improve the productivity and efficiency in the non-trade sector, and this is going to be a challenge in terms of economic policy. But so the thing I want to say that if you have a long vision of the country for the last 40 years, it doesn't matter who's going to be who was in office. We have a way, a clear way. So in the last 40 years in the country, the Partido Nacional, the Partido Colorado, and also the Frente Amplio were in the government, and the policies are different. This is evident, but we have a similar way. So some 2-3 weeks ago, somebody of the IMF told me something that is very, very clear for me. It's like Uruguay is going in a highway in one direction. Sometimes you are running for the left, sometimes you are running for the right, but at the end of the day, you are in the same highway. And this is very important because in the following election, so it's true we have to need to discuss what are the line that we're going to follow, so from the left or from the right. But at the end of the day, we're following the same direction, that we need to open the economy, we need to accelerate the growing. That means we need to introduce important reform in no-trade sector. And for people like me, people coming from the left, at the same time, we believe that we need to introduce proactive policies oriented to reduce the poverty, and especially to reduce the inequality. So just two numbers. This country, as you know, have the better numbers in terms of poverty in the region. So only 10% of the population is in the poverty situation in the country. But when you take into account the ages of the people, we have a very bad numbers here. Around 20% of the childs of the country are poor, and this is a problem. And this is a problem coming from the last 60 years. So this is an important problem, because our social protection model that is very comprehensive and is very big, protect people who are inside of the system. So if you have a formal job, or if you are a formal integration in the labor market, so you are under the protection condition. You have a good health system. You have a good social security protection. You have also a pension opportunities when you retire. But if you are not inside of this a formal relation with the market, so you are in trouble, because this is because the social protection system didn't include that kind of people, and these people, these households are fully integrated for childs, and so this is a problem. This is a very concern. This is a concern for all the political parties. It's not just for the left. It's absolutely right that this is maybe the most important thing that the country is discussing during this electoral time. But at the same time, we have different approaches. So how to solve this? So I just summarize saying that the country, fortunately, the country have a solid democratic situation. This is in part because we have a very solid political parties. We used to have, as Uruguay is a presidential regime, it's very important to have two political parties. You in the United States understand very well this. This is a special condition to support the political system when you have a presidential regime. So Uruguay used to have two political big parties. They used to be, as the President Lacalle mentioned, Partido Blanco and Partido Colorado. But now we are in the process of consolidation of two big political parties, or two big political coalitions, one coming from the left, one coming from the right. And this is very important because at the end of the day, since we have this approach, we have the capacity to stay under the system all the radical positions here. So since Frente Amplio and the coalition have a catch-all approach to this, all the radical positions, all the extreme positions are under the system, and there are no doubt that the system is, of course, this introduces complexity to manage this. This president, the actual president, Mr. Lacalle, have problems to manage the coalition to approve the social security reform that they approve, because there are different positions coming from the right. At the same time, the Frente Amplio have problems to discuss topics related with the social protection system, especially in pensions, as Amparo mentioned. But at the end of the day, the majority, the big majority of the Frente Amplio have the same position, and I can say that in my opinion, the referendum is not going to pass in the next election. But if the referendum pass, we need to have a strategy to manage the situation. This is the reason why I don't think it's a good idea, repeat, and that this is something like similar at the end of the world. This is going to be a big deal. We are going to face a lot of problems, but Uruguay have the experience to manage big problems in the past. We managed a big crisis in 2002, and compare with Argentina or other countries in the region, we have a very good management of the crisis. And so, if we have this kind of problem in the future, we are going to resolve the problem in democratic terms, and also to maintain the credibility and the stability of the institutions and the credibility of the country. So this is the reason why, because the referendum is a concern, but this is not going to be the end of the world if the referendum passes in the next month. Just to say the last word is, in my opinion, the next government, it doesn't matter who is to be in office, need to concentrate on how to accelerate the growth and how to improve the social cohesion of the society. And this is the reason why Nicolas mentioned the problem of the crime and the problem of the insecurity of the country. This is a very important challenge for the political parties, and I believe we have a good opportunity to have a state policies in the future, because I believe that now everybody knows that this is a big problem. It's true, the Frente Amplio, when was in office, have a lot of troubles about these topics. But at the same time, it's true that when this coalition arrived to the government, believes that this is going to be very easy to manage the problem, because it's just the problem that they used to have before 2019 are just just a consequence of bad management coming from the Frente Amplio policies, and they realized during this administration that the problem is very big, and we need consensus, and we need to discuss policies under an umbrella of agreements between the two political parties. So the political parties know that this is a big problem, and know that they need to have an agreement across policies, and I believe we are going to find this solution. It doesn't matter who is going to be in office. So I am an optimistic vision for Uruguay for the future, and I believe we are going to continue doing the things well in the future. Maybe not at the speed that the world moves, but we are continuing in the same highway following this direction that we take many years ago. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Gabriel. We have just
Bien,
about
Gabriel, bien.
we have just about 5 minutes left. I want to give an opportunity for those of you who've joined us here at the Wilson Center. If you have any questions, I have just one more. I'll collect them all quickly now. Please be as brief as possible, and then we'll give a chance for Nicolas and Amparo to answer before we conclude. So hold on, my colleague Facundo Robles and Brian are bringing around microphones. Introduce yourself and be super brief if you would, please. Go ahead.
Laura Tahtanen, amongst other things, Senior Associate with America's program at CSIS. Some questions about external relations, external issues. Commerce, what's up with the China trade deal? It seems like Brasilia and Buenos Aires don't want to see the same kind of exception as was made for the Mexico deal some years ago. How about EU-Mercosur? Some talk about that being a geoeconomic necessity now for Brussels. More generally about investments, there was a broad consensus on forestry and pulp for many years. What about hydrocarbons? Is there a more divisive conversation around that? The PCC contagion issue was mentioned. Is there an Argentine contagion issue hiding somewhere? Maybe real estate, maybe somewhere else. And then very briefly, last point, this is an internal one that hasn't been mentioned. There's a party of the militares in the current coalition, which doesn't seem to fit with the picture of the consensual and timid nature of Uruguayan politics. So just those comments. Sorry.
Excellent. No, helpful, please. Go ahead.
Yeah, so my name is Prab. I actually was looking up Uruguay. I mean, it's pretty close to the ocean. I think you have a good amount of ports, 13 ports, very good. But in terms of airports and airstrips, Uruguay is pretty bad. Back, I mean, if only 140 airports, airstrips, but Colombia, Argentina, Bolivia has over 900. Venezuela, Chile has over 400. What is it that you're doing to increase air base, air power of Uruguay?
Excellent. Was that it for in the room? Okay, terrific. Maybe, Nicolas, if you could answer a question about external international economic policy of Uruguay, the Mercosur trade agreement, the efforts to have a free trade agreement with the U.S. and China, and then we'll conclude. Amparo, if you had any final remarks, wanted to talk about transportation infrastructure or anything we left out. Go ahead.
Sure. About Mercosur and all that sort of stuff. So as you said, Brasilia has basically vetoed any kind of China free trade deal that Uruguay was negotiating. Things are changing. Milei is in favor of Uruguay's position when it comes to Mercosur. He wants reform. He also wants the ability for countries to negotiate independently of Mercosur, which is what Luis Lacalle wanted. So there is movement in Mercosur. Lula will oppose this, there's no question about that. But pressure is growing within the bloc for more reform. There's a window of opportunity for Uruguay and for Argentina, actually, in the 26 elections in Brazil, so that's something to keep an eye on. If Lula or the PT loses and a right-wing government does come into power, there's an opportunity there for some reform. I doubt that it will be, free trade for countries to negotiate with third parties, but I think there is a potential there where you can imagine where countries that are not seen as strategically important, so not China, but maybe smaller economies, there could be opening there for some kind of free trade deal. The one thing about Uruguay that's important to note is that when it comes to foreign policy, Amparo did articulate this well, which is that there is a difference. Uruguay is, sure, the differences are quite small compared to other countries, but when foreign policy, it's actually quite important. And I do think that if the coalition wins, the policies on foreign policy will remain broadly the same. And that means that they will keep on pushing for reform in Mercosur, and they will join Milei in pressuring Brazil to do more. If the Frente Amplio wins, I do think that foreign policy will be abandoned. I think the push towards a free trade agreement with other countries will be abandoned. I do think that Orsi and the Frente Amplio will join Lula in trying to strengthen Mercosur. That's not going to go anywhere either because Milei is not going to want it. So it's just going to be gridlock, at least until 26. And then, and it comes to Venezuela, like I said, again, if the Frente Amplio does enter power, there's questions of what position Uruguay will take with Venezuela. I think that's an important question. And the reason why that matters, finally, is because Uruguay is an important voice in the region. We're a small country. We only have 3.5 million people, but we are seen as a shining light of democracy. And for us to abandon that position would be, I think, extremely problematic for the country's reputation globally.
Okay, Amparo, in 1 minute, go ahead.
Okay, and that was quite the laundry list of things that you pointed out. And I'd like to say that sometimes you have to look a little bit sort of under the radar. So first, I'd like to say that while there was a lot of, I would say, attention paid to some of the rhetoric around Mercosur, there was a historical agreement that allows Uruguay to sell from the free trade zone into Brazil with no tariffs. That kind of went a little bit, that people didn't focus as much, but it's absolutely massive. And it allows for tremendous investment opportunities into Uruguay. This happened, again, without a lot of people noticing. There's also, I'd like to say, and maybe this goes to your question on infrastructure, I'm of the mindset that, yes, Uruguay is relatively far, and actually with the way of the world is going, that might not be such a bad thing. We sort of like it that way. And I have to say, sometimes the focus is a little bit on the tangible, right? Like the tangible goods that are going through borders. And maybe we should be thinking more about services, technology, and IP. And so rather than maybe talking about some of the physical infrastructure, I'd like to say that Uruguay has one of the fastest 5Gs, or technology, I should say, Wi-Fi. It's going into 5G. And it's really just like a tremendous hub for services. When it comes to trade with the U.S., It's really focused on IP. We have the highest software exports per capita in Latin America. So this is kind of an area that, again, we think of borders, we think of products. I think we should think also of services, of intangibles, of that infrastructure that connects us to the world. There's been a couple of announcements recently. So we have the Google data center. So this is massive, right? The data center needs are incredible. Uruguay has a very green hydro system, and so this is a great opportunity for us. There's also Microsoft AI starting a new endeavor in Uruguay. This is the Uruguay we want to complement our agriculture. So I think there's a lot of that's happening that, again, doesn't go through borders, sometimes flies under the radar, no pun intended there, but it's maybe where our future, where a lot of, it complements our traditional economy.
Terrific, Amparo. Thank you so much. I wish we could.
Please, let me say just a brief comment.
Unfortunately, Gabriel, we can't. We do have to finish on time.
But this is important because Nicolas says something. If I understand well, it's not exactly. This is very important.
30 seconds only, Gabriel. Okay.
Yes. If the Frente Amplio win the election, there is not going to be a big change in foreign policy. This policy of this government continues the lines that the government before do in international policy. So I'm not sure that the affirmation of Nicolas is exactly that he expressed. We need to discuss this with more time. Please, I just want to mention this before I end it.
No, I understand. Thank you, Gabriel.
You will do a very good
yes, please.
foreign minister, Gabriel.
Well,
change your future.
As you can tell, there's plenty more to discuss. We'll have other opportunities, including before the election and afterward. I think these are all really important points. And I think we agree that there is a lot at stake in the election and that it could move things in different directions for Uruguay and its foreign economic policy, its foreign policy, its economic policy. But I think we also agree that the democratic institutions are strong, the economic framework is strong, and that no matter what happens in the election, I think Uruguay will be on solid footing. Thank you so much, everyone who was a part of this conversation, Gabriel, Amparo, Nicolas, Pedro, and thank you to Sescos for the generous co-hosting. President Lacalle Herrera, thank you so much for spending time again.
Thank you very much.
It's a long time for you to come visit us again in Washington, and please do, and please travel with your son after his presidency. We would love to have him. Thank you to my team, Facundo Robles, Bryden Sandifer, for your support for this event. Thank you, everyone who joined us online and here in Washington. As I said, we'll continue to follow Uruguay closely, including the election. So please stay tuned for more of our engagement on this important subject and important partner to the United States. Thank you, everyone. Muchísimas gracias.
Thank you very much.